Welcome to the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. This week we consider, what does it mean to die well? And how does a song written 1,000 years before Jesus help us understand Jesus' arrest and trial? And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Well, what does it mean to die well? I guess we might have an image in our minds of what dying well would look like. Maybe softly dropping off to sleep and thinking of it like that, without fear, without fuss, surrounded by loved ones who are sorry to see us go, but with good memories of a life well lived. A person who lived up to what will be written in the short note that's published in the paper, much missed by children and grandchildren. Now, I won't have that written about me because Alex and I are without children. But does that mean that we are unable to die well? Perhaps it is to face death with a fearless serenity, a stoicism, like some of the people I spoke of last week, the death of Plato, who rebuked his disciples from mourning. And we saw that Jesus in the garden was very different. He was filled with fear and with agony. But Christians, we're able to do something that's different to dying well. Because of what Jesus did in his death, we can die with confidence. Psalm 69 is a psalm of David, God's King, God's Messiah, God's Christ. Listen to these verses where we hear God's King writing 1,000 years before Jesus. And he says, "Those who hate me without reason outnumber the hairs on my head. Many are my enemies without cause, those who seek to destroy me." At this end of Mark's record of Jesus' earthly life, it is remarkable to see how closely Jesus' experience followed the experience of God's King recorded in the Psalms, and particularly Psalm 69. That we're going to trace through today. Today we're going to have a look at the events of late Thursday night, April the 2nd, 33 AD. And notice the echoes of Psalm 69 that we find in Jesus' experience of that night. An important example of what Jesus meant when he said that he fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures. Psalm 69 is, of course, in the first place about King David's experience, and it was 1,000 years before Jesus. But Jesus is the fulfillment of the words that David wrote. Jesus is the fulfillment of King David's experience. And this passage that we're looking at today records 5 people or 5 groups of people with different details. But what is common and what is emphasized is how many hated Jesus without reason and how many were enemies without any cause, just like had happened to King David. First, we have the Sanhedrin. Mark 14, verses 53 to 65 is where we find their account. Late on that Thursday night, an armed mob who took Jesus in Gethsemane took him to the high priest's residence in Jerusalem, and the members of the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, met there. This Jewish council, with the authority in religious and political and legal matters, is led by the high priest. It includes priests and scribes and lay leaders of the nation. They were limited by Rome's occupying power, but they are still a powerful group of people. Why did these important people come out so late at night? It's a strange, even suspicious thing to happen, isn't it? And we see in verse 55 that they had a deliberate and predetermined purpose. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. The sentence is already decided, and the purpose is to find a charge that'll stick. This is a lynch mob. It's a kangaroo court. It's done under the cover of darkness, but we find in verse 55 they could not find any. But as we've been reading through Mark's account of Jesus' life, we have said and seen that Jesus knew he would die in Jerusalem. It's been the drumbeat of the narrative ever since chapter 8. Jesus knew that is why he had come, to give his life as a ransom for many. Notice the emphasis here. Jesus is in the hands of his enemies who want him to die, but they can't find a reason to do it. And we think again of some verses from Psalm 69, verse 4, "Those who hate me without cause." They could have been written about Jesus, couldn't they? And in verse 56 of Mark 14, the Sanhedrin bring in some liars to somehow incriminate Jesus. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements didn't agree. So they try another approach in verse 57. Then some stood up and gave false testimony against him. "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another, not made with hands.' Yet even their testimony didn't agree." So this false testimony is quite good. It's almost true. In chapter 13, Jesus said, "Let not one stone will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." Jesus was prophesying the destruction of the temple. He was prophesying the end of Jerusalem and his responsibility for it. But they're not interested in Jesus' meaning. They twist his words and they pin a capital charge on him, a charge of treason. Jesus doesn't buy into this. In verses 60 and 61, he remains silent. The turning point of this narrative is in verse 61. The high priest speaks. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now our ears ought to prick up at this. Back in Mark chapter 8, when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter had answered with these exact words, "You are the Christ." And without realizing it, the high priest has struck the truth. Are you the Christ? Are you God's promised King, the one upon whom the salvation of the world depends? Are you the Son of God? At this, Jesus breaks his silence. In verse 62, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." I am that King, and you will see the promised reign of God come, is what Jesus says. Now just pause and think about this. As you watch this through the words of Mark, who is in control of the situation? Jesus will die. He has said he must die, giving his life as a ransom for many. But he will not die on a trumped-up charge. He will die only on his own terms. He will die as the Christ. He will die as God's King. He will die Son of the Blessed One. The verdict is passed swiftly in verses 63 and 64, without deliberation, but with a swift condemnation of blasphemy. The irony is that he is condemned to death for claiming to be God's king, but it is by his death that God establishes his reign and his securing the salvation of his people. And as if to underline their foolishness, these judges, look at how some of these leaders treat God's king in verse 65. Some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, "Prophesy," and the guards took him and beat him. Now, as we've been reading Mark's account, we want to exclaim, "Prophesy? You idiots! He has been prophesying this very moment, and the abuse you're pouring out on him is itself a fulfillment of prophecy. Psalm 69 verse 7, for example, "For I endure scorn for your sake, and shame covers my face." The scene changes. The second episode, beginning in verse 66, comes to Peter in the courtyard. It's where we left him before. We know him well, don't we, this guy Peter? He's been something of a leader among Jesus' disciples. He is the one who said up in the North Country to Jesus, "You are the Christ." Remember, Jesus prophesied that his disciples would abandon him. But remember what Peter said in response to that? Peter said, "Even if all others fall away, I will not." But Jesus predicted that he would. He would do it before the rooster crowed. Now, to his credit, Peter is here. He's actually in the courtyard of the high priest. I mean, that is a brave action that none of the other disciples took. And as Jesus is being tried inside, Peter faces another trial outside. Verse 66, while Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about." And he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." And he began to call down curses, and he swore at them, "I don't know this man you're talking about." Friends, we are not told this so that we can feel superior to Peter. Mark's account, even as we are being told of Peter's failure, is focused on Jesus rather than Peter. Jesus' suffering and insult even comes from those who are closest to him. Even they let him down. And again we have the echoes of Psalm 69 verse 8. "I am a foreigner to my own family, a stranger to my own mother's children." Even as the Sanhedrin call Jesus to prophesy, out in the courtyard, prophecy is being fulfilled to Peter's grief. We see in verse 72, immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. In chapter 15, verse 1, the scene changes again. As dawn breaks, we move back inside. The Sanhedrin has made their decision, and they take Jesus to the Roman governor, Pilate. Now, sources outside the New Testament tell us that this man, Pilate, was an able administrator, but he wasn't a great politician. But in this account, the account that makes Pilate's name in history, that causes his name to be repeated every week in a creed around the world, he joins in with the Sanhedrin and Peter, and along with the many who are arrayed against God's king without cause. Look at Pilate's question that we see in chapter 15, verse 2. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. The Sanhedrin haven't accused him of blasphemy when they brought him to Pilate. I mean, Pilate doesn't care about that. But they bring a political charge, claiming to be the king of the Jews. Notice that the charge for which Jesus is condemned, no matter what Pilate and Sanhedrin thinks that they actually mean, is actually his central claim. He did claim to be the Messiah. And Jesus' response, "You've said so." It's a phrase that means you've said it with your own lips. Psalm 69's superscript reminded us that the psalm is of David, of God's king, that the psalm was written. God's king, suffering injustice. And then in verse 3 we see that the Jewish officials heaped other charges on Jesus. Pilate points out that this is the case to Jesus in verse 4, but you'll notice that again Jesus is silent. There's a power struggle between Pilate and the chief priests going on here, but in reality it's Jesus who's in control. Jesus doesn't lash out, he doesn't shout, he doesn't defend himself, he doesn't try and win approval. Jesus is silent, and it's a powerful silence. It's a silence that amazes Pilate, we see in verse 5. And we have a scene change again to the people. The leaders of Jerusalem, they feared the people. They'd put off arresting Jesus because of the people. That's why they did all their doing at night. But something seems to have changed in verse 6. See, it's the custom of the festival to release a prisoner whom the people request. Remember that this festival was a festival of the Jews commemorating the release of the Jewish people from their oppression by a foreign occupying power, by their slavery in Egypt, and celebration of being released into freedom. A hope that they would one day experience again. They hoped that they would one day experience a freedom from the Romans. It was quite a strange tradition for Rome to observe this, to release a prisoner, because most of the prisoners were freedom fighters against Rome, and we meet one of these here by name. Verse 7, a man named Barabbas. He was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he normally did. A couple of details about Barabbas. There is a little bit of evidence that his first name was Jesus. But Barabbas is a political figure, a leading political figure, maybe the leading political figure in an uprising. And the name Barabbas means his father's son. Maybe we're being told here that he's from a family well known for this kind of violence, like father, like son. But Barabbas didn't stand for a freedom. Barabbas did stand for the kind of freedom that the people wanted. To their mind, Barabbas stood for what the Passover stood for, freedom from foreign oppression. But Pilate sees through the Sanhedrin, and maybe he wants to play the crowd for his own advantage. And we see that in verse 9. "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one that you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. When you read Psalm 69, you will see how well that psalm of God's King 1,000 years beforehand fits here with Jesus' experience. Psalm 69 verse 4, "Those who hate me without reason outnumbers the hair on my head. Many are my enemies without cause, those who seek to destroy me." The final group of people we meet in this series of scenes are the Roman soldiers. We read about them in verse 16. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, They took off the papal robe and put his own clothes on him and led him out to crucify him. This was God's king. Psalm 69 verse 9, and the insults of those who insult you fall on me. We've seen many enemies without cause who sought to destroy him. A friend was among them, abandoning him. Look again at the person at the centre who has barely said a word. The great irony is that he was the king. Look back at chapter 10 verse 32. A number of weeks before Jesus even came into Jerusalem. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus leading the way. The disciples are astonished, but the others who follow were afraid. Again he took the 12 aside and he told them what was going to happen to him. We're going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, and who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later he will rise. And now, having watched the events of Thursday, April the 2nd, 33 AD, and the morning of Friday, April 3rd, we find that none of what has happened overnight has been a surprise. It's exactly why Jesus came to Jerusalem. It's what Jesus has said must happen. One of the most wonderful things we have in the New Testament is that the same Peter that denied Jesus in that courtyard wrote 2 letters that have been preserved for us, and we find them in the New Testament. Writing to early Christians and remembering that very night we've been looking at, Peter says this: Christ suffered for you, leaving an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. You see the 2 things that were going on that night and what we're going to look at next week, God willing. He suffered for us. All we have heard Jesus experienced in these days were for you and for me. His death is a death with purpose. He bore our sins. But even more than that, for the way in which he suffered is also an example for Christians to live in. Not playing the power game, but trusting God. Not retaliating, but trusting God. Not asserting ourselves. He didn't. Jesus trusted God. Our response to things like the Olympic celebration and that kind of thing, Jesus is an example to us of how we are to respond, and we do it differently. As he went to the cross through that trial, he showed he was entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So let's take a good look at Jesus through the hours of that night, through the hours of that morning, and follow our King. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks.